Today we will look at the daily life of the Han Dynasty. This is Confucius, and you may wonder why you cannot see me. It is because I am hiding in a tree. Ha 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 ha. Why can you not see me? Why am I hiding in a tree? The reason is because though you may not see me, I affect everything for everyone. Confucius said everyone had a role to play, including you. I will make 8 other appearances in the slideshow. Let's see if you can find them too.
Thank you, Confucius. This is Mr. Mayus, and today we are going to look at the Han Dynasty daily life, as you said. Shenyang was the capital of the Han Empire, the Han Dynasty. It was in the capital, or in the state of Qin, where Shi Huangdi, which we talked about last time, took over. And the entire city was surrounded by this big wall all the way around the city. And in the north part of the city was the palace, the imperial palace, and that was where the major temples were. And just outside of the imperial palace was where the wealthy houses were. And these wealthy houses had tile roofs and high walls, and they were around a central courtyard. The poorer people lived further away towards the southern parts of the city. And they lived in mud brick houses, and they had thatch roofs. Now, thatch is basically plants or this type of reed, and it will keep you reasonably dry, but these weren't very luxurious. Here's a modern-day mud brick home. It even has a courtyard there. I don't think that it has a thatch roof, but it is that sort of adobe style brick. Generally, they try to keep the poor people away from the emperor. And there was little sanitation. That means there wasn't a lot of fresh running water or pipes or toilets. The Han lived in extended families. Most homes, rich and poor, would have many generations under the same roof. This means you could live with your grandma or your great-grandma and grandfather if they were alive. And because of Confucius, there was this great obligation to show respect and obedience. Children had to obey parents, and wives had to obey husbands. And generally, the older and more male you are, meant you had the more power. So even if you were married to your husband, and he had control, you'd still have to pay and give a lot of respect to the grandfather or the grandmother living in that house. The the wife would go to live with the male's household. So the new wife coming in wouldn't have much say. She would be sort of underneath her grandmother, or rather her mother-in-law, which isn't always a very good thing. The cities just had the wall, as I mentioned, and just inside the wall, just inside the city gates, was the market. And this was a place to trade any number of things. You could buy and sell anything: clothes, silk, spices, food, vegetables, jewelry, and of course there was entertainment there. Jugglers, or maybe some magicians or something, anything, just to people singing songs. And if you were wealthy, you could buy food. And some of the things were exotic, like owl or panther, or ant eggs. Ant eggs, really? Little tiny things? Yep, they sold them. You can eat turtles and ducks and deer and pig and dog. Things that were fairly common back then. Even if you go to China now, you can still eat some of these odd things. I think they may even have scorpions mixed in there as well. People traded with coins. It looked like this. They had a hole in the middle. Now that hole was so you could slip a string through all of the coins and just tie it up, and you have your little wallet all on a string. Maybe it gives a new meaning to a shoestring budget. We're going to take a look at the social classes of ancient Chinese society. Okay, so of course, you have many different types of people. But generally speaking, because of Confucius, the idea is that if you contributed to society, you had some value. Farmers, they would grow wheat or rice or millet. They were very clever. Instead of having a big mountain here, they'd sort of level it off and flatten it out. Level it off, flatten it out. And they could grow any number of things. They could flood it and make rice in there, or they had trees, orchards in there, or they'd even have mountainsides of wheat. And everything was done by hand. The planting was done by hand. And though most of the people were farmers and peasants, and they were poor, but even though they were poor, they were well respected. They were recognized because everyone said, hey, you guys are doing hard work. You are contributing to this society. Now, the emperor owned everything. So the emperor, of course, heavily taxed his land. But the pay that they would get would be the food to survive. Of course, the emperor was at the top. He ruled over everything. He owned all the land. And if you owned a house, that's because the emperor kind of gave it to you. You would have, like, especially a wealthy person's house, you would have been one of his friends or close people. And he interacted with very few people. His family, his wives, and his concubines or mistresses, and his advisors. And he kind of kept away. And as time went on, because he kept away, he became more and more revered, more and more special. No one was allowed to look at him directly. They would keep their head bowed, or they would kneel in his presence. Imagine if you were kneeling before the king, and you were trying to say something, and then maybe you had to move for whatever reason. You wouldn't stand up and walk away. You'd have to almost crawl away. Or in some instances, you would even lay flat. He did seek advice, and those are from his few close advisors, most of whom were eunuchs. What is a eunuch, you may ask? Great question. A eunuch is a male who has had their sex organs completely removed. And these people, they were the servants, they were not able to interact, they were the only people that the emperor's wives and mistresses, concubines, could interact with. I wonder why that is. Well, that's because they wanted to make sure that the person who succeeds the king, the person who takes over for the king, who becomes the new emperor, is his actual child. So they don't even have to worry about anyone else having to, sleep with his wives or his concubines sleeping with someone else. All of that is, they've taken care of that. If the eunuchs don't have any sex organs, they can't mess things up. However, because they had influence over the emperor, they became very powerful. And later on, they actually would accept bribes from rich people. Someone would pay them, hey, we want this law passed. Maybe you can advise him towards that. So generally speaking, the everyday people didn't like the eunuchs. Okay. The emperor, of course, needed help running the empire. He didn't go out and about much, and when he did travel, he had a bunch of different carts and went with a whole entourage, and the streets had been cleared. But he did need help, and he used the best educated and the very clever officials. Now, this is one of those things that's amazing about the ancient Chinese. The ancient Chinese, the people who he had help him, were the highest level, were called mandarins. Not like the fruit. It's actually a language. It literally means language of officials. And these people would take an hour, or a test that would last for 60 hours, almost 3 days. And the people who took this test, sometimes they'd try to cheat, but if they didn't pass it, they would kill themselves out of shame. Now, there are other people like calligraphers who would write and help manage the taxes and everything with that, but they were less skilled. The most trusted people were these mandarins, and the emperor trusted them, and they were the only people to take care of these high responsibilities. The ancient Chinese were fascinating because they let someone be high in authority, even if they were poor. If you were smart and you were skilled, like the mandarins were, then you could raise in power. Quite fascinating, really, compared to some of the other ancient cultures. You needed to be wealthy and from a family to move on up. Other people were craftspeople. They made bronze pots, copper pots, porcelain, silk. These people made things that were needed and useful. And as they did, even though they may not be the most respected, the most wealthy, they were quite respected because they were seen as visiting, or as, not visiting, as contributing to the Han Dynasty. Another group of people was merchants. Now, merchants would buy some things in this city and travel along and sell it in another city. And their job basically was to make lots and lots of money. They could become quite wealthy, but the thing is, they weren't actually well respected because they weren't seen as contributing anything. Which brings us to the question, who has a higher status, a merchant or a farmer? Well, in the ancient Han Dynasty, though the farmers would have been would have been poorer, they actually had a higher status because they were seen as doing something good for the Han Dynasty. Now, the merchants, so they weren't necessarily well respected, even though they were rich, they actually did something very, very good for the empire. They traveled through some of these rough terrains and brought silk and stuff all the way west, through the Middle East, and even through Europe, which would have been way over there. And that is called the Silk Road. We'll talk about that next time. But basically, this helped trade and ideas pass back and forth. It was quite a good thing for the Chinese. Let's talk about women in ancient China. Generally speaking, daughters didn't get education. They are largely seen as a burden. Even still today, China is one of those countries that has more males than females. Why? Because they'll, in some cases, if they realize that they're going to have a female daughter, they'll abort them. They are largely seen as having no status unless they get married and have a male child. They're not really worth anything. It was a very male-dominated society. So if you were a woman, think about this, you'd have to be subject to your father and your brother. And then if you got married, your father would choose who your husband is, and then your husband and his family would have sort of order over you. And in some cases, even when your sons grew up, they would have power over you. Basically, the only time that people would have more power would be if you were a grandmother and your son had sons. Then they would respect you. Some wealthy women could be educated, but they're still expected to do household chores. And the only women who ever did have real power would have been the emperor's mother or grandmother, or sometimes the wife. Now, there's this practice called foot binding in ancient China. Okay, that's where they would break your foot and they'd wrap the toes around and they'd try to fit in these little shoes. Why? Because it was so beautiful to have little feet. Now, if you don't like graphic images, look away now. Okay, this right here is someone's foot who has been broken, and these are actually her toes here. You can see there's her other foot, her right foot, slipped in there, wrapped around, very painful. They've actually done away with this because it's kind of barbaric, but it's fascinating to look at.
Okay, this is Confucius again. I hope you have had a good time trying to find my 8 other appearances. Let me see if I can help you. Number 1, I am on the wall above the grandmother. Number 2, I am working over the marketplace, making sure everything is happening and helping the society. Here, I am right behind the emperor. I am so sneaky, hiding in the writing. I am there because I can read and I am so smart. Number 4, I am keeping the eunuch company because he is missing something. Here, I am watching these people, ha, I am flying in the sky, ha 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 ha. Here, I am in a pot. Even Confucius need a bath sometimes. Here, I am hiding in plain sight. I am so sneaky, ha 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 ha. And here, I am on the foot. I am a tattoo. I got street cred. Episode 3, could not be done without me.